Welcome to the Heller-Hurwicz Office Hours, a podcast featuring University of Minnesota economists and their research. In this special series of the podcast, we're focusing on the policy priorities of the second Trump administration and how research can inform our understanding of our rapidly changing economic environment. The turn away from free trade has been a major shift. In this conversation, economists Tim Kehoe and Phelan will share differing perspectives on how the president's approach to trade policy is playing out for the United States. I'll start with you, Tim, then Chris. Ask you the same question. Were you surprised? Were you shocked by how broad-based and steeped the proposed tariffs were by Trump and the Trump administration?
Okay, so I assume what we're talking about is the April 2nd, the Liberation Day tariffs.
That's right.
And yes, I think like many economists, I expected significant tariffs, but those were done to meet some formula to try to push for balanced trade with every one of the national units. Some of them aren't countries, but in the world. And that the formula that was used led to some very, very high tariff rates.
Chris? I looked at it as an opening bid, and I'm never surprised by the administration's opening bid.
Basic question, will the tariffs reduce the U.S. trade deficit?
Oh, certainly. Yes. The tariffs will reduce the U.S. trade deficit.
So how? What's the mechanism that how does that happen?
We do have to understand there is a U.S. trade deficit and there's a U.S. trade deficit in goods. And the announcements from the administration never take this into account because the United States has an enormous trade surplus, not enough to compensate for the trade's deficit in goods, but has enormous trade surplus in services. So we're just talking about I would expect the tariffs will reduce the U.S. trade surplus in services, but it will certainly reduce the trade deficit in goods. The overall trade deficit is another thing. And why? It's because we'll purchase more at home. That's one mechanism. At some point, the standard model says it's going to change the terms of trade. That is the value of U.S. goods versus foreign goods. Right now, that's going in the other direction. But I would expect at some point it would reduce that. You see, the value of U.S. goods versus foreign goods also depends on how much foreigners want to invest in the United States. It's not a very straightforward thing.
So, Chris, you're elaborate a bit on your perspective.
Well, obviously, if you set tariffs to, 1,000,000% or something, that more or less makes foreign trade illegal. If foreign trade is illegal in goods, then you're not going to have a deficit because that just means you're buying more than you're selling.
So what's the problem here? So that sounds pretty good. We're going to be buying less stuff from overseas. We're going to be buying more domestically. So why are so many economists opposed to tariffs? It sounds like this will work.
The basic issue is trade is good. I mean, you put somebody off in the swamp, or the woods of Alaska, where they have to make everything themselves and they starve to death. If you put a wall around Minnesota saying that we had to produce our own cars, our own computers, our own tractors, our own food, our own everything, Minnesota would be way, way, way poorer. And so we're all starting from this basic mantra of trade is good, trade is everything. But we don't mean international trade. We just mean the fact that, I trade my services as an economist to the University of Minnesota. They pay me. And so I can specialize in that and not have to produce my own food. So that's the basic thing that almost all economists start with, is trade is good. International trade is a kind of trade. Therefore, doing things which stop it is bad. That's the kind of standard, before you get into any details, perspective of most economists.
So, Tim, I mean, the way you were talking about it, it sounds like the tariffs are doing exactly what Trump wants them to do.
If you want to, if the goal is to reduce the trade deficit in goods, that will go a long ways towards doing it. The thing is that a good goal? So let me change the question. And let me mention just two industries that trade is very, very relevant to the automobile industry and the electronics equipment industry. We produce a lot of automobiles, the trucks, and so forth in North America. We also produce a lot of electronic equipment, both for factories, businesses, and for consumers. There's no such thing as, at this point, as a U.S. automobile industry or a U.S. electronics equipment industry. Those are very integrated with the automobile and electronics equipment industries in Canada and Mexico. So there's no car, the Ford, GM, Dodge truck, there's no car manufactured in the United States that doesn't have a very large set of components, maybe, and in fact, very often the finished assembly from Canada and Mexico.
Not my car. Teslas are made in the U.S. with 85% U.S. parts.
Oh, no, I was mentioning the so-called big three, but I think if you go and look at Elon Musk's statements about it, there's a lot of foreign components in that. They might not actually be from Canada and Mexico. They might be more from other countries, but they'll be affected by the tariffs.
Yes.
The thing about the Ford, GM, and what we used to call Chrysler, some pieces of that manufacturing products go across borders 8 times. And if we put tariffs on them, they will make it impossible to produce those cars using the current production plants. How long is it going to take to retool factories, and automobile executives have talked about this publicly. It'll destroy the automobile industry in the short term. How long is the short term? I don't know. And really no one knows, because we're talking about massive disruptions.
So, Chris, these enormous supply chains, we're talking about tariffs. And so in a world of supply chains, like with the automobile, or you think about 3M, you think about companies like Ecolab, Hormel, I think there's this image that you have these imported goods coming in, and then you pay tariffs on that. But we live in a world of, as Tim was saying, a world of global supply chains. So does that change the way you think about tariffs?
Not really. I think because you can put tariffs on value. If you can put tariffs on the inputs, and then there are ways to do the 8 ways of crossing, taking into account how much of this is domestic sourced, how much of this is foreign sourced. But I want to get into something else, which is they know they're disrupting these supply chains. They would say that's the point. If you want to know what the difference is between a Trump voter and a Harris voter, there's always just one question I want to ask them, which is, how do you think the country's been going? Do you think things have been going relatively well, or do you think that things have been going relatively not well? And the Trump administration, if you say, look, you're blowing up the entire way of the way world commerce takes place, I think their response will be, yes, that's the point.
So that may be the point, but then that raises the most important question, which is this the problems are real? All right, let's just say the
Well, not
problems are real
everybody
wherever you're
agrees with that.
looking. But are tariffs the right answer? Or will tariffs make the situation worse?
I'm not sure that everybody agrees that the problems are real. There'll be a lot of economists who say, just look at the statistics. Things are going great. I'm not one of them. They look at they don't necessarily see the trade deficit, which is about 1.13 trillion. That's the current account is about a $1.13 trillion deficit. And we do disagree on whether that's a problem to be solved or just if foreigners want to invest in the United States, that's great.
The problem that I'm talking about is we have seen through trade, geographic areas are disproportionately hit. Certain industries have been disproportionately hit. Certain people are disproportionately hit. I mean, trade has always been a net calculation, right? It benefits the economy, it benefits the society, but that's not the same thing as everybody benefits from trade. And so to me, the question is for those people who are not benefiting from trade, is tariffs the way to make their lives better?
Tariffs will certainly make some American workers better off because the drop in supply, the elimination of supply of goods from other countries, will make Americans buy goods that are some sort of substitutes from those goods from other Americans. And those people will be helped. I mean, that is one of the reasons why tariffs have been popular for centuries. It's what we call protectionism. Now, it hurts all Americans as consumers because it increases the prices they pay, but it will help certain Americans. And that's just a fact. The question is, how do you balance the well-being of some people versus others? Oh, I think retaliation is already there. That's why China's retaliating, the European Union is going to retaliate, and the Canadians have pledged to retaliate. Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, is thinking she can do it in other ways besides tariffs, but she's talking about eliminating intellectual property protection for Americans in Mexico. Is the current thing she's talking about. So I think if and this is a big if, there's lots of uncertainty. If the Trump administration is going to go ahead with these Liberation Day tariffs, I'll call them the very high ones, the ones that are currently in place are historically very high, but even higher ones, it's inevitable that there's going to be retaliation.
And Chris, do you think that tariffs can reindustrialize America?
The general trend for countries as they get richer is a lower and lower share of employment in manufacturing. So will it completely reverse that? Well, no, because it's not just trade that caused it in the first place. One is just technology changes. But we have a low share of both jobs in manufacturing compared to, let's say, Europe, or a lower share of GDP in manufacturing compared to Europe. So could we use trade policy or other policies similar to them to become like we were in the 1950s? No. Can we do it to become more like, have a manufacturing share more like Europe? Yes. And in fact, I mean, we haven't gotten into national security, but that is one of the reasons why I'm not as, I should say, your median economist very much is for free trade. I'm less so. And one of them is I differ on how much this affects national security. One of the reasons the North won was they were industrialized and the South wasn't. One of the reasons we were so successful in World War II was we were just massively able to produce more of everything, more boats, more planes, more bullets, more screws that are used in the boats and boats and planes, just everything. It scares the heck out of me that there is a country in the position now that we were in then, and it's China. They can produce everything cheaply and massively. We can't.
So, Tim, what do you think of that?
But let me put one asterisk on Chris's the comments about the share of manufacturing in GDP. You see, that uses what we call current prices. And the thing is, the goods that the U.S. produces currently in our manufacturing sector have become so relatively inexpensive over time that if you look at something and you'd want to try to compute it, looking at prices from some years ago and assigning that to the goods being produced, what economists call looking at real output. Do you know when we had the most real output of the industrial sector in the United States? That's easy to answer. That was last year. When would it have been higher if we're not in a severe recession? It'll be this year. So we're producing a very high quantity of technologically sophisticated goods with very few workers. So are we going to become like the United States in the 1950s? That's a very good question. Can we do it? And there is a formula for doing it. And maybe there's some confusion about it, but we have to make the U.S. poor. You know, I was born in the 1950s, but I certainly remember the United States from the 1960s. But how poor were we in the 1950s? Well, about as poor as Mexico is today. If we want to go back and make America great again, like it was in the 50s, we have to make ourselves poor again.
Okay, so I got a follow-up question for each of you. And Chris, the follow-up question is, okay, so what about, do you want to make America poor?
I don't want to make America poor. I don't. There are a lot of reasons. What I don't want to make America as poor in the future. I have no problem with it, except for national security reasons. I don't really have. Trade is good. Like I said, it's everything. It's the cause of wealth. I do think a big problem that is glossed over in all this, I don't think anybody would care about bilateral trade deficits, the fact that we buy more from China than they buy from us, if it was offset by a bilateral surplus with somebody else. But in general, we bought as much from the outside world as the outside world bought from us. We are, in fact, though, running, and have been for about the last 20 years, historically huge trade deficits with the entire world. And that is a problem because they send us goods and services, mostly goods, as Tim pointed out, over and above the amount of services and goods we sell to them. Well, then what do they do with the money? They buy our assets. And that's, either they hold the U.S. dollars, that's an asset, a future claim. They buy treasury bonds. They buy U.S. stocks. About 35% of the U.S. stock market is now owned by foreigners. Essentially, when you're in your own household, if you're buying more than you're selling, you're running down your assets. we are doing this as a country, and we have been doing it over 20 years in a relatively big way, like about 4% of GDP a year. That's not good.
And so, Tim, the follow-up question I want to ask you is to directly address Chris's framing concept about national security. That when we're talking about this, reindustrializing, however you want to define that term, taking the national security concerns seriously.
And I'm going to mention an area which I know I agree with Chris, and it was something we really discovered in a very sharp way during the COVID-19 pandemic. We get most of our chips for electronics. And of course, we were a leader in developing the manufacture of chips, but now the dominant producer of chips that go into your refrigerator, they go into your car. With modern technology, they're everywhere. Those are manufactured in Taiwan. And when we had problems with the supply chains in the pandemic, we saw that brought consumer appliances, cars, any number of sectors, televisions, to a halt. And of course, it brought to a halt the defense industry and so forth. We're dependent on Taiwan. And of course, Taiwan is in perpetual danger of invasion from the People's Republic of China. In fact, when my father was a young naval officer, he spent a long time on an aircraft carrier in the early 1950s when there were hostilities and between the People's Republic and the Chinese who had been the Republic of China, who fled there in 1949. Well, that is a dangerous situation to be in. We were the world's leader in chip manufacturing 25 years ago, even 15 years ago. What happened? Well, the Taiwanese are very good at this kind of thing. It doesn't require quite the level of science to do it as it did 20 years ago. And so they have a dominant position in that industry. But if something goes wrong, we're in trouble. And I agree with Chris, at least on that we should subsidize, we should do what's necessary to have a stable supply of chips.
I guess I would just jump in and say it's not just chips, though. So unfortunately, one of my many vices is looking at Twitter or X too much to see what my colleagues are saying. Hopefully I try to keep it to just what my colleagues are saying. But I see colleagues at other universities saying, boy, Trump said something like there'll be 2 toys instead of 30 toys under the Christmas tree or something like that. And they go, boy, wait till Trump finds out that it's not just toys, it's everything. Wait till we see the empty shelves that are going to hit in a few weeks, because we're halting relatively huge tariffs on most countries, but not China. They're huge right now. And so they're just not shipping stuff over. And my response to that is, I don't know whose side you're thinking that this helps. If it's really the case that we're going to have empty shelves in 4 weeks because we get everything from China, to me, that's an argument for taking the hit now. At least we'll know how dependent we become on them. Because that's not a good situation. I would say that the greatest single policy mistake of the U.S. government over the last 50 years is letting an aggressive, pretty totalitarian, large, and I would say also very patient player into the world trading system. It's been a disaster.
Tim?
Well, I disagree. I mentioned chips because I was thinking that was an area that my friend Chris and I could agree on. Uh,
That
and
doesn't make a good podcast.
but but you see, because chips, the cutoff in the supply of chips, because they were essential intermediate inputs to a very large set of U.S. industries. Losing those imports really damaged the U.S. economy, and I would like protection against that. Now, let's turn to toys. When the People's Republic of China became a very major player in the world trade, and that was the 1990s. See, it doesn't go back 50 years, Chris. It's more like 30. It's in the 1990s that China became a big player, and then especially after they joined the WTO in 2001. But the major thing that they exported to start with was actually children's toys. So they kind of took over the children's toy industry first. So if you buy an American toy from an American company called Mattel or something like that, that's going to be something that was manufactured in China. I have to admit, I kind of agree with Chris on this. Having the U.S. not be able to import all these toys, that could be a hit we might take. And it's not going to have the same impact because the toys aren't intermediate inputs to automobiles and electronics and refrigerators and so forth. So there'll be a lot of unhappy parents and children next Christmas if we can't import toys. But when we look at economic statistics, we're not going to see that production in all kinds of other industries fail. In fact, this was the big, from the economic point of view. If I had wanted in 2012, when President Trump started 2018, when President Trump started the trade war with China, he chose the wrong sectors. He actually hit lots of imports of intermediate goods. And I have had a couple students working on their theses related to that at the time. If he had done a more strategic choice of Chinese sectors to put the tariffs on, he could have really hurt China without hurting us so much. But the sectors on which they put the tariffs were ones that supplied to American manufacturers and American exporters. So we hurt the U.S.'s ability to produce industrial goods and to export them.
Back to you, Chris. I just want to, as we're looking at, going through this, one of the big concerns out there is that this is going to raise prices. And we just went through a recent bout with a high rate of inflation. It's pretty much come down. But, it was clear there was a consumer rebellion against inflation in recent years. So how big a worry is rising prices in the kind of tariff regime that we're talking about? Is it sort of a one-time step up? Is it something that leads to a spiral? Is it something that's just being exaggerated? And look, you maybe get a little higher price on this and that, but it's not that big a worry.
It's between the second and the third. It's a one-time step up, but it's certainly, if you can't buy cheap stuff from China or Vietnam or make the other countries, Mexico, whatever, there's just cheaper labor in those countries, and labor is embedded into the price of goods. And if you have to hire expensive Americans to do it, it's going to cost more. That's a one-time step up. How big? I don't know.
No, and let me reinforce Chris's point. Here I'm agreeing with him. We always see that Americans who aren't economists get confused when you think about an increase in prices versus inflation. Inflation, we're not going to get. Inflations are continual increases in prices. We're not going to get them if the Federal Reserve System decides not to let the money supply increase. We will get a jump up in prices. The reason we're going to get the jump up in prices is, of course, because it's going to be we're going to pay for the tariff, or we're going to pay for inputs from a less efficient American producer when we buy a good. But also, what it's doing to the economy is, and Chris acknowledged this, is making us a little bit poorer. That's going to happen, but that's an upward jump in prices. And it presumably would not result, it'd be in measured inflation in the first quarter, the first year we're looking at, but it wouldn't be continual. What happened in the 1970s, for people who have been around long enough to remember that? Well, we had these oil price shocks, and there were related shocks that hit us. We would call them supply shocks. And the Fed decided to, in answer to that, to keep interest rates low and to let prices rise. We continually, not just...
they printed a lot of money.
Yep. And so that's how we got stagflation. The tariffs are not going to result in stagflation unless the Federal Reserve does what we economists call accommodating those shocks. Now, we had Governor Adriana Kugler of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System here last week talking about this. And she was saying, if we don't do that, there's not going to be continual inflation. So we don't have to go back to the 1970s, but there will be a price shock.
So, Chris, put aside the president's rhetoric, some of the arbitrary nature of some of what's going on, but take the notion of he believes in tariffs. He believes tariffs is how you're going to increase the productive capacity of the United States, at least in the goods part of the market. That this is actually a reasonable gamble, a reasonable risk to be taking.
I think all of that depends on how much you like the status quo, how much you think that the status quo is sustainable. I was asked, I did a talk this morning, and someone said, this is a bull in a china shop. And I went, well, the question is whether the bull in the china shop is worth the fact that some china needs to be broken. If you think that the current path we're having is basically okay, Americans right now are doing really well up until, that was a thing that people worried about with this election. Why are Americans so unhappy? Because all the statistics say that they shouldn't be. But they have the idea that we cannot continue to spend $1 trillion more every year than we earn, in a sense. That bad things happen from that. So if you believe that that's the case, then whether or not this kind of relatively sledgehammery way of going after it is warranted, it depends on how much you think it would have been possible to do more fine-tuning reactions to that problem. So you have to, one, think that there's a problem, and two, think that it wouldn't have been feasible to fix that problem in a more fine-tuned way.
So, Tim, what is your reaction to that?
I admire Chris for his logic, but you're not going to be surprised to see that he will understand my logic. I don't agree the problem is as big as he thinks it is. I think the U.S. economy, and especially it's been obvious since the pandemic, we are the healthiest major economy in the world. And And I just am surprised that we're losing that, and in losing being the healthiest economy. And I expect there's a very high chance that in 3 months we will look back and know that we were in a recession right at this moment. Because we just saw that real GDP dropped in the first quarter, and the rule of thumb that the NBR Business Cycle Dating Committee uses is that 2 consecutive quarters of drops in GDP, real GDP, are a recession. We'll have to see. That's not a fixed rule. But I do think the United States had been doing, up until this calendar year, we have been doing very well. And I would have hoped we're going to do better. We're doing better than the other major countries in the world. China's in a slowdown. And that's something I'm doing work on right now to study. It's not clear that China's going to be growing as quickly in the next few years as it has been. And not because of the trade war. They were on a bad track to start with. No, I kind of believe in the United States, and I think we're doing well, and we shouldn't be doing this.
So what is both this whole discussion about tariffs and, looking at history, it leads me to think that, the post-World War II period toward lowering trade barriers is something of an anomaly, that, we're going back to the way international economic relations used to be. That if we were having this conversation in the 19th century, there'd be, slightly different emphasis, but people say, yeah, of course. So is the freer trade period, just to call it that, is that the anomaly, Chris?
Oh, I don't know. Certainly, yes. Most of American history, Tim's the much better historian than I am on this. These tariffs, at least that are being proposed, are high even compared to, let's say, the 1920s in the United States. I don't think we're going to end up there. I think we will end up with much higher tariffs than what we had 5 years ago. But again, I'm going to say that the big political divide is, I think that the Trump administration has been quite open about the fact that they want to renegotiate the post-World War II economic order. That's what this is. This was their way of getting people's attention that we're serious. And it's not just the post-World War II economic order, it's the post-World War II security order that is connected because someone's got to pay for aircraft carriers. And this is, I would say that the April 2nd speeches were a way of getting people's attention that that they are serious about turning the tables over and saying we're going to negotiate a new way of doing things that is going to be fundamentally different from what you said might be an anomaly, the way that we have done things post. Bretton Woods was all the major victors essentially of World War II getting together and deciding how they were going to set up international trade.
So Tim, with taking that, long historic look, how do you look at that post-Bretton Woods, post-World War II period that up until recently?
Well, so let me mention, and we've talked about this before, one product of and it was the United States as the leader of what they called the United Nations that pushed for this what they called the New World Order, which included, and the U.S. was the leader in pushing for free trade throughout the world. But that had an enormous impact throughout the world, and it made the citizens of the world richer people. So if we look back at, say, 1960, and this is another project I've been working on, in 1960, most countries in the world, and the majority of the world's population, had not gone through a period of economic growth in their country of, say, 30 years, like Great Britain experienced in the early 19th century. And they called that the Industrial Revolution. Walt Rostow called it takeoff into sustained growth. Well, most of the world had not done that. And globalization, which President Trump wants to make a bad word, globalization led to a situation today where there are very few countries that haven't done that. And the view of the Americans and the United Nations in the late 1940s is having that kind of prosperity will keep us out of situations like the Second World War. I mean, that was explicitly, they said that.
And it's absolutely the case if you just look at the fraction of people who live on an income that about you could afford at $900 a year per person. That's enough to not starve to death and not die of exposure. And the fraction of the world's population in the 1970s that lived on what would now cost $900 a year per person was probably between 20 and 25%. It's about 5% now. So I do like to say, yeah, in the last 40 years, we've seen the greatest decrease in material human suffering in the history of the world.
That's right.
But, the hat doesn't say make the world great again.
So Chris, looking ahead, what are you watching? What do you think people should be watching to judge whether or not tariffs are actually accomplishing some of the things that you're talking about or not?
Not quarter to quarter, but I do think that the main thing is the current account deficit.
So define the current account deficit for us and why that's the main thing.
Current account deficit is how much we're as a country spending over and above how much we can afford to spend without selling parts of our assets to foreigners. If the current account deficit is zero, that means we're spending basically as much as we can afford without having to sell off assets to foreigners. And so I would say that the measure of success, at least over the long run, is stopping that from being $1 trillion a year.
Okay, it's always unfair, but when you say the long run, is that like over the next 5 years? Because give us a time frame.
3 or 4 years. Yeah, not a generation, but not the next 3 quarters.
Okay,
three or 4 years.
So Tim, what are you watching the judge? How these tariffs are doing?
We haven't really seen the impact of the tariffs yet. One of the reasons, and this is why I mentioned when we were talking about the contraction in GDP last quarter, one of the big reasons we had that contraction in GDP is we had a huge surge in imports from companies that were anticipating the tariff increases. So I'm not even sure that and if I were on the NBR Business Cycle Dating Committee, they're the ones who say if we're in a recession or not. I'm not even sure I'm going to say that last quarter was recession, but I think we're going to have a recession this year. If the goal of the tariffs, and you hear President Trump and people in his administration switching the goals from being to reindustrialize America or just lead to better bargaining positions, or whether it's going to be to raise revenues. You can't have the 3 of those at the same time. In fact, you can't have any 2 of them at the same time. So we'll have to see what's going to happen. But I expect that the United States is going to there's a good chance, if the tariffs would disappear tomorrow, that what I'm thinking isn't going to happen. But if they stay in place, and the Chinese are certainly not willing to bargain with President Trump at this point, or at least they say that. President Trump says he's bargaining with the Chinese, and the Chinese say no, they haven't talked to him at all. So I'm not going to comment on that. But if this situation keeps up for a couple more months, we're going to be in a recession this year. It's going to be painful. UPS laid off a huge number of drivers this morning. Of course they have to. There's not things for them to carry around.
So what has surprised me now, again, I'm the age that was shaped by a lot of the whole thing with during the Reagan administration, Japanese automobile industry, tariffs. I mean, Congress was deeply involved in the whole tariff discussion. And what has struck me, I'm just curious whether either of you, same way, Congress doesn't seem to be a player in this current discussion.
That's right.
Well, that's a legal thing, constitutional law thing, which is for the most part, I think the biggest mistake that the founders made was that each branch of government would be jealous of its powers. Congress is just simply not jealous of its powers. It's certain, and this is a bipartisan thing. They're perfectly willing to have all the hard decisions be made by the executive.
Last, I just want to say, any last parting thought when it comes to tariffs? And arbitrarily, I'll ask Chris and then Tim. So, Chris?
My guess is we're going to end up in a situation where we have much higher tariffs than we did, which were pretty close to 0, 2 to 3, on average. I think they're going to be closer to 10%. I don't see, and they could continue to be 100% or whatever on Chinese goods. But I would be very surprised if it continued to be much higher than 10 for countries which have traditionally been our friends.
Tim?
It's an exciting time, and I tell my students, and we have quite a few students from other parts of the world here, and people are nervous. I'm nervous, but we're economists, and this is going to give us stuff to study. These policies are certainly radical, and they're unprecedented since the 1930s. So we're going to have a lot of data to look at. I think that I would hypothesize. How about that? That the supporters of President Trump, like my friend Chris, they will realize next year that it was a mistake to support this policy, that it's going to lead to very bad consequences for the United States.
Well, on that note, I'd like to thank both of you. This has been great. I've really enjoyed this a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Tim Kehoe and Chris Phelan are economics professors at the University of Minnesota. Office Hours is a production of Matriarch Digital Media, hosted by me, Chris Farrell, executive producer, Twilight Dang, producer and editor, Beth Gibbs, music by Bob Bradley. A special thanks to Heller-Hurwicz, Hannah Fairman, and Anna Adamson. Subscribe to Heller-Hurwicz Office Hours to hear about the economic research being done at the University of Minnesota. And to learn more about the research we discussed today, visit hhei at umn.edu. Thanks for listening.